U.S. enforces full-spectrum blockade. Iran faces immediate economic pressure. U.S. Navy interdicts 9 tankers attempting to breach blockade. Donald Trump. China agrees not to supply weapons to Iran. The blockade is now active, raising tensions. Iran-bound vessels are no longer treated as commercial traffic, but as potential targets for U.S. naval forces. The operation extends into international waters with broad enforcement coverage. U.S. Central Command confirms full-spectrum implementation across all vessels transiting to and from Iranian ports and coastal zones, including the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, effectively targeting Tehran's entire maritime network. Non-Iran-linked shipping lanes remain open. Vessels servicing Gulf states or Iraq continue normal operations, while Iran-bound traffic faces heightened risk of surveillance, interdiction, or denial of passage. While not total, the blockade is already triggering cascading risk effects, prompting multiple carriers to reroute or avoid the area. Iran has begun to respond, but the real impact is economic. With heavy dependence on maritime trade, the constriction of sea lanes delivers a direct shock to the national economy and elevates the risk of crisis under further escalation. Iran's daily trade flows are now at elevated risk, about $270 million in exports and $160 million in imports. The export structure is heavily energy dependent, with roughly $140 million per day from crude oil and the remainder from petrochemicals, minerals, steel, and metals, around $80 million daily. Disruption at sea impacts not only oil revenues, but the broader industrial ecosystem. As cargo movement stalls, cash flow is effectively choked off, raising the likelihood of widespread production slowdowns. This is the core objective: economic paralysis without direct conflict. Alternative channels, overland transport, or sanctions evasion remain limited and inefficient. If sustained, export losses alone could reach up to $8 billion per month, significantly intensifying economic pressure on Tehran. These losses compound rapidly, creating significant fiscal pressure. The impact goes beyond exports. Imports, critical to economic stability, are also severely disrupted. Iran imported roughly $58 billion in goods last year, about $160 million per day, primarily consumer goods and industrial inputs. As supply flows tighten, the impact spreads quickly across the industrial base. Factories are forced to scale down or suspend operations, driving unemployment and income loss. This creates a trigger point for wider cascading effects, where economic strain can rapidly translate into social instability, mirroring previous protest cycles driven by economic pressure. This pressure is now hitting a critical limit: storage capacity. Storage capacity has emerged as a critical bottleneck. Iran's total oil storage is estimated at 50 to 60 million barrels, much of it already utilized. At roughly 60% capacity, only about 20 million barrels remain available. Limited headroom as production continues. At one point, 5 million barrels per day, remaining capacity could be filled within 2 weeks. Once storage is saturated, production shutdowns become unavoidable, creating a key operational choke point in Iran's energy system. Well, shutdowns cause both immediate losses and long-term degradation. Restarting wells can reduce output by 5 to 10% per well, meaning Iran faces not just immediate revenue loss, but a sustained decline in future production capacity. As economic channels contract, pressure begins to shift into other domains. This is where the dynamic changes. This is the turning point. Economic strain is pushing Tehran into a more proactive posture. When economic tools lose effectiveness, the remaining option is to generate geopolitical pressure to break the tightening constraints. The pressure is becoming structural. If not relieved, the country risks self-inflicted damage as losses compound over time. In the oil sector, each percentage point of capacity represents billions of dollars, making well shutdowns effectively large-scale value destruction. With revenue streams under threat, Tehran is unlikely to accept a prolonged disruption of cash flow. Rising pressure is already reflected in increasingly urgent rhetoric. Iran has declared U.S. maritime restrictions unlawful, though this position is contested when viewed against its own prior actions. Past attacks on civilian shipping, including vessels from non-involved states, have created precedents that are difficult to ignore. As a result, Iran's criticism of similar actions by its adversary creates a credibility gap, particularly when some officials label the blockade an act of war, creating internal contradictions in its own framing. U.S. Navy interdicts. 9 tankers attempting to breach blockade. These impacts are not theoretical. They are being shaped directly by how the blockade is enforced on the ground. On April 15, 2026, the U.S. military announced it had intercepted 9 oil tankers attempting to breach the blockade of Iranian ports. This action is part of a broader campaign directed by President Trump to intensify economic pressure on Tehran. The development highlights early deterrence effectiveness, where signaling alone has been sufficient to compel compliance without requiring direct coercive force. USC Central Command reported that within the first 48 hours of the operation, no vessel successfully penetrated U.S. control. All 9 tankers complied with orders to turn back toward Iranian ports or coastal areas without the need for forceful boarding. According to a senior defense official, all intercepted vessels were oil tankers, and none required physical boarding by U.S. forces. Nevertheless, the message conveyed by naval forces underscores the firm enforcement posture of the operation. In radio warnings, U.S. personnel emphasized the legality of the blockade, instructing vessels departing Iran to return immediately, and those en route to abort their voyages. The warning further stated that any violation could result in control, seizure, and the potential use of force if necessary. At the same time, a U.S. destroyer intercepted 2 additional tankers that had departed Chabahar port on the Gulf of Oman a day earlier. Both vessels received radio warnings and were compelled to alter course. CENTCOM reported that more than 10,000 U.S. personnel, including Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force units, alongside over a dozen warships and dozens of aircraft, are participating in the operation. Within the first 24 hours alone, 6 commercial vessels turned back in compliance with U.S. directives. The operation applies regardless of vessel nationality, targeting all traffic to and from Iranian ports and coastal areas, including the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Meanwhile, the United States maintains that freedom of navigation is preserved along routes not linked to Iran, particularly through the Strait of Hormuz. Admiral Brad Cooper, commander of U.S. Central Command, stated that the blockade has been fully implemented and that U.S. forces currently hold overwhelming maritime dominance in the Middle East theater. He further noted that approximately 90% of Iran's economy depends on international maritime trade, and that within less than 36 hours of enforcement, Iran's seaborne commerce had been effectively paralyzed. As the blockade continues to tighten, the impact on Iran's already fragile economy is becoming increasingly pronounced. Under mounting pressure, Tehran is shifting to a familiar strategy: escalation signaling to generate counterpressure. Iran has accused the United States of economic terrorism in the Strait of Hormuz and has signaled the possibility of expanding tensions to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. At the strategic level, if Iran cannot break the blockade at Hormuz, it is compelled to expand the conflict space toward other critical choke points in the global energy system. Bab el-Mandeb represents a vital artery of global trade, channeling oil flows from the Red Sea to Asia while linking directly to the Suez Canal, one of the most important transit corridors between Europe and Asia. This interconnected structure means that any disruption could trigger cascading effects on a global scale. Should tensions spread to Bab el-Mandeb, the crisis would extend far beyond the regional theater. This is the strategic leverage Tehran is attempting to activate, internationalizing the conflict to force broader recalibration by external actors. However, this approach carries significant risk. Proxy forces have previously disrupted maritime routes, but were ultimately forced to scale back following sustained military retaliation. While Tehran may retain the option to reactivate such tactics, past precedent suggests the cost could be both rapid and severe. More importantly, the true inflection point no longer lies solely in Tehran or Washington. It now lies elsewhere, in a larger variable, reshaping the strategic landscape: China. China's energy dependence on the Gulf is substantial. Roughly 20% of its oil imports come from Russia, 11 to 13% from Iran, alongside major suppliers such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Oman, and Kuwait, most of which transit through the Strait of Hormuz. This turns Hormuz from a US-Iran issue into a direct threat to China's energy security. Once a major power's core interests are engaged, escalation can go global, fast. As China's energy exposure enters a risk state, the negotiating balance shifts immediately. This is no longer a two-party confrontation, but a three-sided strategic equation, with increasing pressure emanating from Beijing. Approximately 50% of China's oil imports depend on routes through Hormuz, making it a critical node in the global energy system. Notably, current disruptions are driven not only by U.S. enforcement measures targeting Iran-bound vessels, but also amplified by Tehran's own strategic responses, further destabilizing flows toward China. When risk starts affecting the core interests of external powers, the strategic environment shifts. Beijing has already begun to act, and that pressure is now translating into diplomacy. Roughly 1 week earlier, China applied pressure on Iran to move toward a ceasefire and encouraged Tehran to engage in negotiations in Islamabad. This signals that China is no longer a passive observer but an active participant shaping the trajectory of the crisis. From the U.S. perspective, increased Chinese pressure is expected, given Beijing's immense energy demand, arguably exceeding that of the United States. When core interests are threatened, China is likely to compel Iran to de-escalate. While no formal meeting schedule has been announced, 21 hours of closed-door negotiations in Islamabad indicate a firm U.S. negotiating posture. According to diplomatic sources familiar with the talks, Vice President J.D. Vance outlined a set of red lines. Iran must cease uranium enrichment, dismantle major nuclear facilities, remove highly enriched material, and fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz without imposing transit fees. Additional conditions include a broader regional stabilization framework, signaling that U.S. objectives extend beyond the nuclear file. A key requirement is that Iran terminate support for proxy forces such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. This is not merely a military demand, but a strategic effort to dismantle Tehran's regional influence network. Notably, Washington appears to be recalibrating its approach to Iran's ballistic missile program. Current signals suggest reduced emphasis on limiting missile inventories, potentially allowing Tehran to maintain or even expand its arsenal without direct pressure in negotiations. However, this flexibility is offset by a harder line elsewhere. Contrary to earlier expectations of compromise on Iran's support for Hezbollah and the Houthis, the United States now treats this as a non-negotiable red line, given its direct implications for regional power balance. In reality, these conditions are not new. They predate the current escalation. Their persistence reflects a consistent U.S. strategy, not only to constrain Iran's nuclear capabilities, but to systematically limit its proxy-based influence across the region. Another notable proposal is a complete freeze on uranium enrichment for 20 years, a strategic freeze designed to extend stability while deferring more comprehensive negotiations to a more favorable environment. These developments are moving rapidly into high-level political action, signaling that the situation is entering a more sensitive and less controllable phase. That shift is already visible at the highest level. Donald Trump. China agrees not to supply weapons to Iran. In the early hours of April 15th, President Donald Trump stated that China had agreed not to transfer weapons to Iran. He simultaneously issued a deterrent message. Negotiations remain preferable to war, but the U.S. military possesses unmatched strength and operational capability. In a subsequent post on Truth Social, Trump wrote that China was very pleased with the United States fully reopening the Strait of Hormuz on a long-term basis. "I'm doing this for them and for the world," he wrote. "This situation will not repeat itself. They have agreed not to send weapons to Iran. President Xi Jinping will embrace me when I arrive there in a few weeks." Addressing U.S.-China relations, Trump adopted a dual-track tone, both conciliatory and firm. "We are working effectively together and achieving real results. That is far better than war. But remember, if we have to fight, we are very good at it. The U.S. military is far superior to any other." In an interview with Fox News released the same day, Trump told host Maria Bartiromo that he had exchanged letters with President Xi Jinping earlier in the week, following reports that China might provide military assistance to Iran. "He just sent me a very good letter," Trump said. "He was responding to the letter I sent because I heard they were supplying weapons." I asked him not to do that, and he responded that, basically, they are not doing it. Trump did not specify the timing of the exchange. He is expected to meet Xi Jinping in Beijing on May 14th to 15th. Previously, sources told CNN that U.S. intelligence indicated China was preparing to transfer new air defense systems to Iran in the coming weeks. This suggests Tehran could use the ceasefire window to strengthen its military capabilities with external support. However, these reports contrast with official statements from Washington, highlighting a clear gap between political messaging and intelligence assessments, an indication that the real situation may be significantly more complex than publicly acknowledged. 3 sources indicated that Beijing planned to route such equipment through a third country to obscure its origin. The systems in question reportedly include man-portable air defense systems, MANPADS, which have historically posed significant asymmetric threats to U.S. low-altitude aircraft during the 5-week conflict period. These developments prompted a strong warning from Trump. If China supports Iran militarily, the United States would impose a 50% tariff on Chinese goods. In the Fox News interview, he referenced reports of potential MANPADS transfers, stating, "I doubt they will do it. Maybe there was a little at the beginning, but if we find out, a 50% tariff will be applied. That's a very big number." On the same day, the Financial Times cited leaked military documents indicating that Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, had covertly received a Chinese-built satellite in late 2024. During the U.S.-Iran conflict in March, Iranian forces reportedly used this satellite to monitor and locate U.S. bases in the Middle East, supporting missile and drone strikes. According to the leaked documents, the satellite, designated TEE-01B, was developed by EarthEye and launched from China in late 2024, before being transferred to the IRGC's aerospace division. This is no longer just a blockade. What we are seeing is a multi-layered strategic competition, where economics, energy, and geopolitics are tightly intertwined. Miscalculation is no longer a distant risk, it is now becoming likely. And when it happens, the consequences will not stay contained. They will spread across the global energy system. The question now is simple. Is the United States stabilizing the situation or pushing it toward a new cycle of escalation?